Albert Camus is often described as the writer who broke with the left, as though his intellectual life followed a familiar political arc: youthful idealism giving way to caution, rebellion cooling into restraint, moral passion yielding to moderation. The phrase suggests retreat. It implies that Camus abandoned justice once justice became difficult, or that he withdrew into ethical purity when politics demanded hard and uncomfortable choices. This interpretation is widespread, and it is wrong. Camus did not abandon the moral impulses that first aligned him with the left. From the beginning of his career, he was hostile to exploitation, suspicious of concentrated power, and deeply concerned with human suffering. His early journalism in Algeria focused on poverty, disease, unemployment, and the quiet humiliations imposed by colonial rule. He wrote about overcrowded housing, hunger, and lives narrowed by political neglect. He did not write as a theorist explaining oppression, but as a witness describing its effects. When Camus briefly joined the Communist Party in the 1930s, it was not because he had embraced doctrine. It was because the party appeared at that moment to be one of the few organized forces seriously opposing colonial injustice. Even then, his allegiance was uneasy. He resisted party discipline and distrusted systems that demanded intellectual conformity. He was sympathetic to socialist aims, but instinctively suspicious of total explanations of history that claimed to reveal the final meaning of human struggle. This suspicion deepened during the Second World War. As a member of the French resistance and editor of Combat, a clandestine newspaper produced under Nazi occupation, Camus confronted violence not as abstraction but as necessity. He did not deny that resistance sometimes required force. He understood that occupation itself was a form of violence that could not be reasoned away, but he insisted that even resistance must remain morally constrained. Violence, he argued, might be unavoidable, but it should never become righteous, automatic, or celebrated. It must remain tragic, something endured rather than sanctified. This insistence on limits is central to understanding Camus' later isolation. Camus never believed that politics could be made pure. He believed something far more demanding, that politics must remain aware of its own danger. The moment violence becomes morally clean, it stops being exceptional. It becomes method, and once it becomes method, it reorganizes everything around it. Killing ceases to be a failure and becomes a technique. The moral world narrows. The post-war period brought this danger into full view. After 1945, large parts of the European left underwent a transformation that Camus found increasingly disturbing. Marxist theory came to function not only as political analysis, but as moral authority. History itself was treated as a judge. Revolution was framed as inevitable. Violence was no longer tragic, but necessary. What mattered was not whether an act was just, but whether it aligned with the supposed direction of history. This shift altered the moral language of politics. Killing ceased to be murder, if it could be justified by reference to the future. Repression became defense. Camps and purges were described as unfortunate but unavoidable stages on the path to liberation. The language of necessity insulated violence from judgment. Once an act was declared historically required, criticism could be dismissed as naive, reactionary, or complicit. Camus understood the psychological effect of this logic. When you believe history is on your side, you no longer experience violence as a moral problem. You experience it as duty. The conscience is quieted not by argument, but by certainty. And certainty is dangerous because it removes the inner resistance that normally restrains cruelty. Violence becomes easier, not because people are more vicious, but because they are more convinced. This was the point at which Camus began to diverge sharply from the post-war left. He saw that politics was no longer being measured against human suffering in the present, but against an imagined future in which suffering would supposedly be redeemed. Individual lives were weighed against abstractions and found expendable. The human being became a means rather than an end. For Camus, this was not a refinement of justice, but its corruption. Justice that demands the suspension of moral limits is no longer justice. It is ideology wearing ethical language. Camus refused to accept the idea that history could absolve murder, or that a future society could retroactively justify present cruelty. No historical narrative, however persuasive, had the right to erase responsibility for harm done here and now. This refusal is what is often described as Camus' break. But it is important to understand what he actually rejected. He did not reject solidarity with the oppressed. He did not reject the demand for equality. He rejected a political logic that asked him to stop judging, a logic that replaced conscience with obedience, doubt with loyalty, and moral hesitation with accusations of betrayal. Camus believed that the moment a movement demands your silence in the face of cruelty committed in its name, the moral relationship has already changed. Solidarity becomes complicity. Politics becomes a machine that feeds on justification rather than truth. At that point, remaining within the movement no longer means struggling for justice. It means providing cover for violence. This is the foundation of Camus' break with the left. It begins not with cynicism or retreat, but with refusal. The refusal to surrender moral judgment to history, and the refusal to treat human beings as expendable material for a future that cannot answer for itself. The decisive moment in Camus' break with the left came after the Second World War, when political argument increasingly gave way to historical certainty. In the devastation that followed the war, many intellectuals searched for meaning in catastrophe. Marxism, for a large part of the European left, offered not only explanation but reassurance. History, it claimed, had direction. Suffering was not meaningless, it was necessary. Violence, if aligned with history's movement, could be justified in advance. For Camus, this way of thinking represented a profound moral danger. He believed that the moment violence is justified by appeal to history, it ceases to be limited. History is not a conscience. It does not feel remorse, hesitate, or doubt. When people claim that history demands an action, they are no longer weighing that action morally. They are surrendering responsibility to an abstraction. This shift had immediate consequences for how violence was understood. Killing ceased to be treated as a tragic failure and became a historical instrument. Executions were reframed as purges. Camps became transitional necessities. Repression was defended as self-defense. Language itself was altered so that suffering could be absorbed into theory without disturbing those who authorized it. Camus was alarmed not only by the violence itself, but by the calm with which it was defended. He noticed that once violence is declared necessary, criticism becomes almost impossible. To object is not to raise a moral concern, but to reveal oneself as ignorant of history, hostile to progress, or secretly aligned with reaction. Moral hesitation is redescribed as betrayal. This, for Camus, was the beginning of moral paralysis. When history replaces conscience, there is no internal mechanism left to restrain cruelty. Any act can be justified provided the narrative is persuasive enough. Violence becomes easier not because people are more vicious, but because they are more convinced. Camus believed that this conviction was particularly seductive for intellectuals. Unlike those who commit violence directly, intellectuals experience it at a distance. They write, argue, justify, and explain. They speak of necessity and inevitability, while others carry out the acts and bear the consequences. Theory creates insulation. It allows one to feel morally serious while remaining untouched by the reality of suffering. This is why Camus repeatedly insisted that explanation is not justification. To say that violence arises from historical conditions is not to excuse it. To explain why something happens is not to declare it morally acceptable. When explanation is allowed to replace judgment, ethics collapses into description. Camus did not deny that history exerts pressure. He denied that pressure absolves responsibility. Human beings still choose. They still decide what they will permit themselves to do. History does not kill. People kill, and people remain responsible for what they do, regardless of how convincing the story is that surrounds their actions. The post-war left increasingly rejected this view. History was treated as a force that swept individuals along, reducing moral agency to participation or resistance. To resist history was to stand in the way of progress. To hesitate was to side with oppression. Camus refused this framing because it transformed moral life into a loyalty test. He saw that once movements demand loyalty before judgment, they cease to be accountable. They begin to treat criticism as threat rather than correction. At that point, violence no longer needs to justify itself ethically. It needs only to demonstrate its alignment with the correct side of history. This was not an abstract concern for Camus. He watched as reports of repression, executions, and camps were dismissed or minimized by those who claimed to speak in the name of justice. Suffering was acknowledged only when it could be used rhetorically against enemies. When committed by allies, it was reframed as necessity or ignored altogether. Camus believed that this selective moral vision was fatal. Justice, if it is to mean anything, must apply universally. It cannot depend on which side commits the act. The refusal to apply moral judgment consistently is not realism, it is surrender. By the late 1940s, Camus recognized that he no longer shared a moral language with much of the left. The disagreement was not over tactics, but over limits. Camus insisted there were lines that could not be crossed without destroying the very idea of justice. The post-war left increasingly treated those lines as obstacles. This is the context in which Camus' break hardened. He did not drift away. He was pushed out by a politics that no longer tolerated restraint. What was once considered a safeguard against cruelty was now dismissed as weakness. Camus refused to accept that inversion, even when it cost him allies, influence, and belonging. The publication of The Rebel in 1951 marked the moment when Camus' growing distance from the left became impossible to ignore. What had previously been a quiet divergence hardened into a public rupture, most clearly expressed in his conflict with Jean-Paul Sartre and the intellectual circle surrounding les temps modernes. This conflict is often reduced to personality, rivalry, or wounded pride. In reality, it was a fundamental disagreement about responsibility and the moral limits of political action. Sartre increasingly accepted the view that history imposes obligations. If oppression is structural, then violence directed against that structure can appear justified. In this framework, refusing to support revolutionary violence is not neutrality but complicity. One either participates in the historical struggle or stands in the way of it. Moral hesitation becomes a failure to assume responsibility for the world as it is. Camus rejected this reasoning entirely. He believed that the appeal to history functioned as a moral alibi. By invoking historical necessity, individuals avoided naming their own choices. Violence was no longer something one decided to commit. It was something history required. Responsibility was displaced from the person to the process. For Camus, this displacement was the core moral danger of modern politics. History does not act. It does not kill, imprison, or torture. People do. Even under extreme conditions, individuals still choose what they will permit themselves to do. To deny this is not realism, but abdication. Camus insisted that an intellectual cannot escape responsibility by appealing to forces larger than himself. To justify murder is to participate in it morally, even if one never commits the act directly. The hostile reception of The Rebel made clear how unwelcome this insistence had become. Camus was accused of moralism, of clinging to abstract principles while others confronted political reality. He was portrayed as a man unwilling to dirty his hands, as though restraint were a sign of immaturity rather than discipline. The implication was that seriousness requires blood on one's hands, and that refusal is a luxury available only to those insulated from struggle. Camus saw through this rhetoric. The language of dirty hands easily becomes a way of glorifying power. It transforms violence into a badge of authenticity. Those who kill are deemed serious. Those who refuse are dismissed as sentimental. Camus believed this inversion was profoundly dishonest. The refusal to kill is not evasion, but recognition of what killing means. What is childish, he thought, is the belief that murder can be made clean through theory. For Camus, the problem was not only the act of violence, but the way violence reorganizes moral perception. Once murder is justified as necessary, doubt becomes weakness, scruples become obstacles, questioning becomes betrayal. Violence no longer needs argument, it needs only loyalty. At that point, power no longer answers to ethics, ethics answers to power. This was why Camus refused to separate political commitment from moral judgment. He believed that movements which demand unconditional allegiance inevitably lose the capacity to correct themselves. Without limits, power expands. Without limits, repression escalates. Without limits, the original reasons for revolt are forgotten and replaced by the maintenance of authority. Camus did not argue that refusing violence would solve political problems. He argued something more severe, that justifying violence guarantees new ones. Every act of violence committed in the name of justice creates fresh injustice that must then be explained, minimized, or denied. The intellectual who grants moral permission for cruelty cannot later disown its consequences. Responsibility does not vanish because the cause was noble. The disagreement with Sartre was therefore decisive. It revealed that Camus and much of the left no longer shared a common moral framework. Camus believed responsibility begins precisely where justification ends. When explanation becomes excuse, ethics dissolves. When ethics dissolves, politics becomes administration of force. The break that followed was not theatrical. Camus did not announce a new allegiance or embrace an opposing camp. He simply refused to speak the language that made murder sound reasonable. In an intellectual climate increasingly organized around ideological loyalty, that refusal was enough to make him an outsider. By the early 1950s, Camus' break with the left was no longer a matter of abstract disagreement. It became anchored in concrete realities that could not be theorized away. The most significant of these was the growing body of evidence concerning repression in the Soviet Union. Labor camps, show trials, forced confessions and executions were no longer rumors. They were documented facts. The question for intellectuals was no longer whether these things were happening, but how they should be spoken about. For many on the left, the response was evasion. Some denied the reports outright, dismissing them as propaganda. Others acknowledged them but insisted they were exaggerated. Still others admitted the facts while arguing that such repression was an unfortunate but necessary stage in the construction of a just society. Camus rejected all three responses. For him, the issue was not strategic but moral. If injustice is excusable when committed by one's own side, then justice has ceased to exist as a principle. Camus believed that silence in the face of known atrocities was a form of complicity. He did not argue that Western systems were innocent, nor did he deny the crimes committed under capitalism or colonial rule. His demand was simpler and more uncomfortable. Moral judgment must be universal. It must apply regardless of which flag is flying or which ideology is invoked. Once judgment becomes selective, ethics collapses into loyalty. This refusal to excuse repression isolated Camus further. Criticizing the Soviet Union was increasingly treated as betrayal of the broader struggle for equality and emancipation. To speak openly about camps and purges was to risk strengthening reactionary forces. Camus understood the logic of this argument, and he rejected it. Truth, he believed, does not become false because it is inconvenient. Suffering does not become acceptable because speaking about it may benefit one's enemies. Camus saw that ideological politics had begun to treat human beings as secondary to narrative. What mattered most was not what had happened, but how it could be framed. Victims disappeared into statistics. Crimes were absorbed into theory. The individual face of suffering was replaced by abstract justification. This, for Camus, was the final moral failure. Politics had stopped answering to the human being. The Algerian War brought this failure into Camus' own life with unbearable force. Born in Algeria, Camus was tied to the land not as an abstraction, but as a place of memory, family, and belonging. He opposed colonial domination and supported reforms aimed at equality and dignity for Algerians. At the same time, he refused to endorse indiscriminate violence, particularly terrorism directed at civilians. This refusal made him an enemy to both sides. Camus' famous remark about choosing his mother over justice was widely misunderstood. It was taken as evidence of sentimental weakness or moral confusion. In reality, it expressed the core of his position. Justice that demands the death of innocents is not justice. A politics that requires one to accept the murder of one's own mother, as collateral damage, has already crossed the line into abstraction and cruelty. This stance satisfied no one. The French right distrusted Camus for condemning colonial injustice. The revolutionary left despised him for refusing to sanctify violence. He found himself politically homeless, attacked from all sides, and increasingly silent in public debates. But this silence was not retreat. It was refusal. Camus refused to speak a language that made killing sound reasonable. What emerged from this isolation was the final clarity of Camus' position. He did not believe history could be redeemed. He did not believe politics could deliver salvation. He believed only that human beings could refuse to make the world worse in the name of making it better. This was not optimism, it was moral discipline. Camus' break with the left, seen in this light, was not a rejection of justice, but a defense of it. He refused to trade conscience for belonging. He refused to excuse cruelty for the sake of victory. He refused to allow human beings to be sacrificed to futures that could not answer for the suffering they demanded. This refusal cost him allies, influence, and security, but it preserved the integrity of his thought. Camus remained committed to revolt, but only to a revolt that remembered why it began, to resist humiliation without becoming an instrument of it. In an age intoxicated by certainty, Camus insisted on limits. That insistence made him isolated. It also made him necessary.